Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 454, featuring Joe Letteri, Senior Visual Effects Supervisor over at Weta FX. Now, I have had many legends on this podcast over the years, people like Doug Trumbull or Richard Endlin, but I am super excited to include Joe. He is truly an incredible person. Amazing stuff that he's done. He has been nominated for 11 Oscars, and he has won 5 of those, including the Avatars, 2 of the Lord of the Rings, and King Kong. Incredible person to talk to. Can't even tell you about it. He has the greatest perspective on the industry from the widest point of view down to the minute, most important part of technology, including, we talk about everything here, about AI and how it's going to affect the industry, to ray tracing, to virtual production and the future of in-camera compositing. So much details going in. Now, I did have a limited time with him. This was recorded over at the View conference, and I only had about 20-30 minutes with him. And so I wanted to make sure we got a lot of information. Luckily, we did. And so while this is a very short podcast, we go over a lot of information. So hang on tight and listen carefully, because Joe is delivering on a lot of really important things in terms of where the industry is and where it's going. So really excited to have him on, and I'm super happy that we had that opportunity. Okay, in terms of announcements, I got a couple things. Just go to chaos.com for all of our product announcements. The big thing we have right now is V-Ray 6 Update 2 is out. If you'd like to know more about that, you can just go again to chaos.com. Some of the new things included is a cross-platform integration with Enscape that we've been developing, which is really, really cool. We also have Material X integration. Yes, it is Material X, and we have enhanced USD support along with many, many more advancements that are going on. This is part of V-Ray 6 Update 2 for 3ds Max. All the other platforms will be following shortly. But again, go check it out at chaos.com. In terms of events, just go to chaos.com/events. This month, we do have an interesting thing. We have a webinar going on right now with our good friend Nikos Nikolopoulos, and he's doing an ArcViz masterclass with creative lighting. And this is going to be going on December 6th through the 25th. But there's going to be 8 episodes in a series that he's going to be doing starting from December 7th all the way to September 26th, 2024. So lots of good stuff going on. Again, go to chaos.com/events to reserve your seat in this webinar, and see the other ones happening next year. Okay. Now, if you guys want to know more about the podcast, of course, you guys can go to our podcast page. It's just go to chaos.com/CG Garage. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook, we are at facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. If you'd like to watch this podcast, all of our videos at Chaos are posted on youtube.com/Chaos Group TV, including this particular podcast. And you can check out all the other podcasts there. And if you have any comments about this podcast, or you'd like to make suggestions of other ones, we've been getting really great suggestions over the last several months. Just go to labs@chaos.com. Again, that is labs@chaos.com. But for now, please enjoy episode number 454 with Joe Letteri.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
Thanks, Joe. Congratulations on the amazing work that you've done. Congratulations
Thank you, Chris.
on your latest Oscar as well.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I just have a couple of questions. What was your inspiration for getting into doing the things you do?
It was sort of this mix of science and math and art. Like I was studying, physics and math, and I started seeing computers being used to make visualizations, essentially.
Right.
And I thought that was, pretty interesting. And then, I started getting into fractals. Like there was that was all sort of coming out in those days. And really the only way to make those was having your hands on a computer. So I talked my way into letting somebody who had a computer let me use it, and because they weren't that common in those days, and just kind of learning as I went, and just enjoying it and getting more and more, interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah. So those sort of early, like the 1980s or early 80s?
Yeah, late 80s, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And how did you end up at Weta?
I ended up at Weta because Peter was doing Lord of the Rings.
Right.
I was at ILM at the time, very interested in doing character work, and I had worked on a film called Magnolia.
Oh, right.
And Lauren Ritchie, who was the vice president of visual effects at the time at New Line, was also, New Line was handling Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. And so she got me in touch with the people at Weta.
Sure.
And I was just totally interested because Gollum was just one of my favorite characters,
sure.
from the books. And I thought what a great chance that would be to work on that. So, I thought it was going to be just a 2-year project, go in and work on, 2 towers and Return of the King, and then head back home, and that never happened.
Well, that was really interesting. But one of the questions that actually Vlado had was, what do you prefer? Do you prefer CG or miniatures?
CG, I've never done miniatures.
You've never done miniatures?
No, I've only done CG.
Always been interested in CG?
Yeah. Like I said, that's because I came out of doing, engineering, computer science, math, physics. I've never done miniatures. Well, we've used them on Lord of the Rings,
right? But
I've never built them.
You weren't
myself.
Part of that process.
I was part of the, in a way, like planning the shots.
Sure.
Because as a supervisor, you plan the shots, you work all that stuff out.
Right.
But I've never built miniatures myself.
Right.
Yeah.
If I look at stuff like Avatar, first Avatar, and definitely the second Avatar, the insane amount of technology that's being developed to make that happen is just kind of mind-blowing. It almost feels unattainable to most people to think about how much technology can be developed for that film. How do you think that, there's an idea of trickle-down technology, but sometimes even trickle-up technology? How do you feel that technology that you guys have developed is going to permeate through the process, through the world of CG?
Well, I think like anything else, you test these things, you try them, and when you see they're successful, people will look at if there's a place for them in their next production, if it makes sense for them to try it or not. And they may or may not. I mean, we built a really sophisticated simulation engine for doing these big water scenes.
Right.
If you don't have big water scenes with characters coming out of the water with, like I said, water dripping off of their eyelashes and into the ocean,
right,
you may not need that. Now, there's things to be learned there, even if you don't need that, but you may just not need anything that big. So, people always look at their own projects and try to figure out what they can take from it and what's useful.
Right. Mm-hmm. But in that production, you were not just involved in the CG, but a lot of the physical stuff that was involved in creating that, like the motion captures and all those things.
Well, you have to be. I mean, visual effects these days, we're long past the point where it's a post-production process. We're involved very early on to help plan it all out.
Right.
Yeah.
What about virtual production? The idea of virtual production right now. I mean, obviously, you guys revolutionized the idea of virtual production on Avatar when it was starting, and we're thinking about virtual cameras. What are your thoughts about virtual cameras and their evolution as we go?
Well, again, the way we would use them on Avatar or Hobbit or most of the films that we've done them with, they've been as a director's tool for visualizing what's not on set. Now, these days, I think the term has come to mean anything that's got an LED screen behind it.
That's a different kind.
Yeah, but that's, I haven't really had the chance to work that way because it hasn't fit the films that we've been doing. Like, it didn't really fit Avatar. Avatar was more about, can we see this other world out there that we're going to put in? Because we just knew we wouldn't ever get there with a screen. Plus the sets were too big. There was no room for screens.
Right. But the virtual camera has become such an important part of the process.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think between what you guys are doing and in Jim's vision, the idea of having a marriage or even like a digital twin of your physical camera. What are your thoughts on how you create those twins?
Well, for us, the big breakthrough was doing the real-time depth compositing
that
I was talking about earlier, because that took away the final barrier. Anytime you had a camera with a digital character in it, and you have something in the foreground and a character in the background, and the character slapped over the thing in the foreground, it immediately breaks your sense that I'm seeing the real thing. Whereas when you can have real-time depth compositing, that changes it. That makes it, really give you the impression that you're looking at the proper world. You can dolly past something. You can do things with depth that you would do with live action without having to think about it. So to me, that was a much more important breakthrough than having, things behind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Now, Jim is obviously very sophisticated when it comes to CG. He can understand what he's looking at. He can see where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
But real time right now, we're seeing advances in real time that are starting to make that difference between what's going to be final and what's on the virtual screen much closer.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about how that's going to affect directors beyond Jim Cameron, who's been able to see that? In
sure. I mean, again, it depends on the project. Like, can you get it close enough that it's usable?
Right.
Because if you can't, in some ways it becomes a distraction or misleading.
Okay.
Where you think you're seeing something, or the director thinks they're seeing something that's going to be on the screen, but in reality is not going to be.
Right.
So it really just depends. Like, for example, if you can't ray trace everything in real time and you have to revert back to using shadow maps, but your shadow maps have the wrong resolution, or you've got a big detailed scene and you start turning some of them off, you get a false sense of the lighting.
Right.
So you can't believe that. So you have to know that what you're seeing is a guide, it's not the real thing.
Sure.
And when you're working with a director, it's making sure that line, you know where that line is.
Right.
That it's going to change if if we're looking for realism later. But if you can get the realism now, yeah, why not? I mean, I guess the only key there is you need to know what you're doing far enough ahead that you're doing all the effects work before the shoot.
Right.
Which is also unique. You're building the assets and you're texturing them and you're getting all that approved in time for the live action.
Right. Fix it in pre as opposed to fixing it in
Exactly
post.
right. Exactly right. Yeah.
And you mentioned ray tracing. Do you think ray tracing is going to be the thing that unlocks some of that stuff in terms of real time?
Well, between ray tracing and path tracing, which I know are similar but different, path tracing is really the only technique that, at least from a mathematical perspective, solves the problem, right? So yeah, if you can't path trace, you're biasing your solution somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's technology that we're working on at Chaos to sort of do path tracing in real time for virtual production.
Yeah.
Sort of considering those things.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. Someone else brought up a question that I thought was very interesting, and they're wondering, as someone in the Academy who've seen it specifically how visual effects are being looked at in the Academy, what are your thoughts about how AI is going to influence? If someone creates something using a lot of AI, how will that influence their ability to be considered for an Oscar or things of that nature? Do you think there's going to be a certain bias towards work that is not AI based?
You mean like within the visual effects range?
Sure.
That I don't really know. And again, it depends what you mean by AI. Like I said, we used AI, or more properly a neural network, for our facial animation system.
Right.
Yeah. And that seemed to be very well received.
Sure.
But again, we're using it as a tool, like a super brush in essence for the artist, not to replace what the artists are doing.
Right.
But I can't say how people are going to feel about that. Because remember, a couple of years ago there was the film, what was it called? Welcome to Chechnya, that one?
Yeah.
Where,
that was fabulous.
Exactly, and everyone was really interested. And that was using, basically almost off-the-shelf AI.
Right.
But the fact that it was used in that situation, to help hide those identities as part of the documentary.
Right.
Everyone thought, well, that's actually fantastic.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
I've actually interviewed Ryan on this podcast as well about it, so it was really kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think there's definitely tools like, for example, very advanced denoisers that can that are an AI tool that can do it.
They are, and that's so bread and butter that no one's going to consider if you're using that or not.
Right.
Like I was making the point earlier, you kind of have to.
Right.
Like, a path tracer is great, but path tracers really can't solve the noise problem in any practical sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with AI they can.
But that's
right.
That's an AI as a denoiser, essentially.
Yeah. Yep.
Because you're applying it at the end of the chain.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's difficult to put that within the path tracer.
Yes.
There are places where it does work, and yes, you can use it, but path tracer is a pretty complicated beast. It
Sure.
doesn't, the same engine doesn't work everywhere.
I found because recently we've added the new ray reconstruction stuff that NVIDIA is doing to our Vantage renderer.
Yes.
And we're able to get some extraordinarily clean renders with one sample per pixel.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. Really.
Yeah.
So in terms of the AI stuff, I just want to hit on it a little bit more, if that's okay. Method, for example, recently revealed that they had been using some generative AI stuff for what they've done. Now, of course, lots of artists were involved. It was a very creative process, but just that concept, there was a backlash in the community about that. What are your thoughts about that?
Again, to me, it's a tool. If it makes sense to use it, use it.
Right.
I think the more important thing to be aware of, and this may be part of like what's going on with the writers and the actors, is you should only be using things that you have a right to use. You know what I mean? So, but if you're using it in that fashion, if you're essentially not stealing someone's performance and using AI to essentially take credit for it as a shortcut, then you've done the work.
Right.
So, whatever tool you use, AI is really just another engine.
Yeah, for sure. What are some of the things that are, obviously you've created so many things that inspire other people in visual effects. What are some of the things that are created that inspire you, or especially more recently?
Good question. Because I tend to still look more towards live action films.
Right.
Because that's where, you want that reality component, to come off of it.
Sure.
You don't want to, keep feeding, you don't want to be in a feedback loop of just visual effects. You want to keep going back to live action as you're grounding.
Sure.
Yeah.
What are some of the live action things that you think exciting you right now?
I'm trying to think. Because again, it will just come down to particular performances. What actors are doing, looking for moments in it.
Right.
I'm trying to think of anything off the top of my head, but nothing really new. You know what I mean? Like I'll tend to go back and look at old stuff, like looking at Burt Lancaster in The Leopard. That kind of stuff where it's a whole different world and a whole different feel, and how did they bring it about?
Sure.
Because you've got actors in period costume out on location. That they must have had a certain feeling when they did that. Is there something we can learn from that to make sure that when we're doing something which is a totally unique location, there's something there? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't.
Right.
But I tend to look for those kinds of things. Yeah.
I think what's interesting about 2023 is that it seems to be a bit of a shift in terms of the conversation about CG that I think is fascinating. Mm-hmm. And there's three films that have come out this year that sort of create this very interesting dichotomy. If you look at Avatar, obviously a film that costs a lot of money with incredibly complicated CG, yet that was not almost part of the conversation. People loved the movie for everything it was, which means you guys achieved what you're supposed to with CG.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And then you compare that with Everything Everywhere All at Once that uses all kinds of very interesting and weird CG that's done on a shoestring budget.
Yes, yeah. Which again served the story very well.
Did serve the story.
It was almost that sort of comic book anything goes feeling. It was great.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you do Oppenheimer, which is an incredibly rich film that celebrates its use of practical stuff. Mm-hmm. How do you feel that those three films, as sort of these very different points of view of what filmmaking is, how do you feel they all can live in the same world?
They all used, for the things you're talking about, heavy amounts of CG. My understanding, even Oppenheimer did.
Yes.
Like they shot a lot of elements, but I would guess the compositors would tell you they weren't sitting around on their hands with all those elements. Yeah.
But what do you think about like the fact that someone can be in their basement doing some computer graphics and creating a great film, and then at the same time that's diametrically opposed to the massive amounts of work that you guys are doing in Avatar?
A lot of that depends on the scope of the film. It's look, if you can sit there and do it all yourself, that's great. Like I remember that from the old days. That's really a lot of fun to do. But the bigger the production gets, the more you really do need that specialization, because you're just getting into it so deeply.
Right.
Like you can't expect someone who understands, you know, how to do a simulation on an open ocean with a lot of characters in it, to also be the one, you know, animating a character's tail. Like there's too much work to be done. So that specialization almost comes naturally the bigger the film is.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. Obviously, as a VFX supervisor, you think of many different specialties. You're not a specialist in one particular thing. One of the questions we got was, what do you do? Do you have any kind of rituals to prepare you for something? Let's like you've got a massive day where you've got a bunch of things happening. How do you prep for that day and feel ready to go?
I don't really prep for the day. We just we start off with dailies. Like that's been a way of working like ever since film days, right? You start off in the morning looking at what you got from the night before and just starting to figure out where you need to go next. Yeah. Yeah.
What was some of the things that you guys invented besides the fluid sim that you guys sort of invented that it sort of inspired you
for this film?
Yeah.
The excuse me, the fluid sim, you know, Loki, which was used for fire and water.
Yeah.
The facial animation system I've talked about, the depth compositing. Those were all really key elements for us.
Do you see those things evolving even more into new things?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You can always make something better, especially after you've done it for the first time.
Do you see the depth compositing as evolving into almost going into complete real-time final frame?
Well, real-time again means is your compositor taking advantage? Your compositor meaning your compositing software.
Right.
Is that taking advantage of the GPU?
Right.
And if it is, then that's a possibility. If not, it will be an offline process.
Right.
But it will be the same technique. Yeah.
Same technique.
That idea of having per pixel depth. Like I said, on the first avatar, we started doing that for everything. The renderer spits out per pixel depth, you know, so trying to extract that out of the real world makes sense because that's the best way to put the two together.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's only like a deep compositing, basically. So.
It's totally deep compositing.
Right.
It's just a bit, like deep compositing when you're generating the elements is much easier than when you're trying to learn the depth from something that's been shot physically.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got another couple of strange questions. Someone asked me if you can think about some of your first work, and one of them is the opening shot of Star Trek 4.
Star Trek 6.
Six, sorry.
That was the first shot I ever did for a movie. Yeah. Blowing up Praxis. That was great. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
So that was, I had been interested, I was only at ILM for a short time, and I'd been interested in doing fractals, making clouds and things like that. I was sort of just doing, in-off hours on my own time because obviously we had the gear there to do it.
Right.
Scott Farrar had just shot Backdraft, and he was the supervisor on Star Trek 6. And Backdraft did this technique they called brain flame, where, to get the sense of the fire creeping along the floor, what he did was set a fire against you have a fire source here against a pan. You angle the pan up, you control the speed of the flow.
Right.
And you flip it upside down and comp it on the floor, and you see fire creeping along the floor.
Right.
So he wanted to use a technique like that to get the explosion, but it just wasn't practical at that size. You just couldn't really control it. So they came to me and said, "Can you do something with it?" And I had really, to do fractals, I discovered RenderMan with programmable shaders. And it's like, okay, so it was a combination of really hand-animated geometry to hang all this stuff on, and then writing what was meant to look like a flame fluid sim effect, but just doing it all in shaders. Just writing shader code. Yeah.
Was that kind of an exciting thing for you to do?
It was great. It was really great because the thing about writing code like that in a shader is like you have access to every pixel. You can make the screen do what you want it to do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Alexei who used to work over at Weta, and he's asked me about. He said you have a passion for astrophotography. Is that true?
That's true. Yeah.
So how did you get into that?
Well, it's the other way around. When I was a kid, I was studying physics and astrophysics, and I thought I was going to go into astronomy.
Right.
But then I got sidetracked in the last few years, as I've started to free up a little bit more of my time overnight.
Right.
I've just been doing
into that.
Yeah, going back into it. Yeah.
So what are one of the latest things that you've been photographing?
I'm trying to think what the last thing I photographed was. I can't remember in order what it was, but what's great about being in New Zealand is there's southern hemisphere objects.
Completely different sky.
that you get to see. Yeah, yeah.
And do you use a telescope, or do you, you use a telescope? And
it's all deep sky.
It's all deep sky. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I know your time is limited. I think we're at about a half an hour, right? So this has been amazing. I appreciate it. I know you've got a flight today, so.
I'm not a flight today. I'll be around later, but I've got someplace I've got to get to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for doing this.
All right. Thank you, Chris.